Okay, let's dive deep into one of the most, well, bizarre and overlooked abilities in the natural world. The power some animals have to sense Earth's magnetic field.
Mm-hmm.
It's called magnetoreception, and basically gives them a hidden compass, or maybe even a kind of biological GPS.
It really is one of nature's quiet marvels.
Hmm.
This sense is completely beyond our normal human perception, yet it's used by an astonishingly wide variety of life forms.
Right.
From migrating birds and butterflies to fish, mammals living underground, even microscopic bacteria. For a long time, the scientific community was frankly deeply skeptical that animals could even do this.
And what makes it even more incredible, based on the sources we've explored for this deep dive, this pile of articles, research notes, comprehensive overviews, is the possibility that this ability, in some creatures, might actually involve quantum mechanics.
Yeah, quantum mechanics.
Yes.
Yeah.
The weird physics of the tiny, tiny world potentially operating inside a warm, wet living cell. It's kind of mind-bending.
It really pushes the boundaries of what we think is possible in biology. So our mission today is to try and make sense of this hidden world. We want to understand the leading ideas for how animals achieve this.
Okay.
Explore the different mechanisms, from the quantum possibilities to more classical physical interactions. See how scientists are even able to study something so subtle and uncover the most recent breakthroughs and, of course, the big unanswered questions in this field. It's pretty dynamic.
Sounds like a fantastic journey into an invisible sense.
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning. What exactly do we mean by magnetoreception?
Fundamentally, it's the ability to detect the geomagnetic field for orientation and navigation.
Okay.
Unlike seeing light or smelling chemicals, it's interacting directly with a fundamental physical force of the planet. And as you said, there was historical doubt, definitely. But now it's, unequivocally confirmed across all major groups of vertebrates and numerous invertebrates, too.
And as we dug into the material, it became clear that scientists have really focused on two main ways animals might be doing this. Not just one method, but two primary hypothesized mechanisms.
That's right. The two leading ideas are the quantum radical pair mechanism and the magnetite-based mechanism. And it's important to keep in mind they aren't mutually exclusive. The evidence suggests some animals might even use both systems.
Okay, let's unpack the first one, because this is where it gets really interesting with the quantum connection, the radical pair mechanism.
This one relies on the bizarre behavior of electron spins at the quantum level. The key players are often light-sensitive proteins called cryptochromes.
Cryptochromes. Okay.
Yeah. The idea is that when a cryptochrome molecule absorbs a photon of light, say, in a bird's eye, it triggers a chemical reaction that creates a pair of highly reactive molecules called radicals.
And these radicals have these unpaired electrons with spins, like tiny magnets. Is that's a fair way to think about it?
Exactly. Tiny magnets and their spins are linked, or quantum mechanically correlated. They exist in one of two specific states. A singlet state where the spins point opposite ways, or a triplet state where they point the same way.
Singlet or triplet? Got it.
Now here's the remarkable part. Earth's magnetic field, weak as it is, can actually influence the rate at which these radical pairs switch back and forth between the singlet and triplet states.
Really? So the magnetic field slightly nudges the spins, altering the balance between these two states.
Precisely. And crucially, the singlet and triplet states react differently with other molecules in the cell. So depending on which state the radical pair is in when it reacts, you get different chemical products. This means the yield of a specific chemical signal ends up depending on the radical pair molecule's orientation relative to the magnetic field.
Wow. So the magnetic field is literally changing the outcome of a chemical reaction, and that changes the signal, like a chemical compass needle.
That's the idea. If you have millions of these molecules in a structure like the retina, molecules oriented differently with respect to the magnetic field would produce different amounts of these chemical products.
Creating a pattern.
Creating a pattern that the brain could potentially read as direction. And what's fascinating is that this mechanism makes a specific prediction that matches bird behavior really well. It functions as an inclination compass.
An inclination compass. What's the difference there?
Well, instead of pointing strictly to magnetic north, like a regular compass needle, an inclination compass tells you the angle of the magnetic field lines relative to the Earth's surface.
Okay, the dip.
Right, the dip. Near the poles, the field lines dip steeply into the ground. Near the equator, they're nearly horizontal, so an inclination compass helps an animal distinguish poleward, where field lines dip steeply down, from equatorward, where they angle up or are horizontal. The radical pair mechanism naturally predicts this due to how the spins align and react.
And migratory birds behave exactly like they're using an inclination compass, not a polarity one. That's a powerful match for the theory. The sources also highlight that this needs light, right?
Yes, typically blue or green light, which is what cryptochrome absorbs to kick off the radical pair formation. And a crucial piece of evidence, something that really points towards this mechanism, is how weak oscillating radio frequency, or RF fields, can disrupt this sense.
RF fields, like radio waves.
Exactly. These fields at specific frequencies can interfere with the spin dynamics of radical pairs. So if you expose birds to these fields, they get disoriented.
Wow.
But a compass based on physical magnets, like the other mechanism we'll talk about, wouldn't be affected by that kind of RF field. It's a key diagnostic test.
That's a really compelling piece of the puzzle for the radical pair idea.
Yep.
And the sources explain that the quantum effect is possible even in a warm, messy cell because the radical pair reaction is so fast. The quantum correlation lasts long enough for the weak magnetic field to exert its subtle influence before the radical pair just decays.
It's a fleeting quantum state, but it lasts just long enough, we're talking microseconds, for the Earth's tiny microtesla field to make a difference. It's really one of the most exciting examples of what people are calling quantum biology.
Okay, so that's the radical pair story, likely linked to cryptochrome in the eye, acting as a light-dependent inclination compass. What's the other main hypothesis, the magnetite-based mechanism?
This one is perhaps easier to visualize. It involves microscopic crystals of magnetite.
Magnetite. Iron oxide.
Exactly. It's a naturally magnetic mineral, basically a form of iron oxide. Think of them as tiny, permanent magnets within the animal.
Like little compass needles made of rock inside their bodies.
That's the basic idea. These tiny magnetite crystals are thought to be connected somehow to sensory cells, perhaps linked mechanically to ion channels on the cell membrane.
Okay.
So when an external magnetic field is present, it exerts a physical force or torque on the crystal, causing it to shift or twist slightly.
And that tiny physical movement could literally pull open or push close the ion channels, sending a signal.
Exactly. That mechanical deformation is transduced into a nerve signal. Now, unlike the radical pair mechanism, this one doesn't need light. It can potentially detect both the polarity,
North versus south.
which end is north and which is south, yes, and also the intensity or strength of the magnetic field. And because it's a physical structure, these receptors could theoretically be located in various places in the body, not necessarily the eyes.
And finding magnetite in animal tissues is common, I gather.
It is. Magnetite crystals or magnetic iron particles have been found in birds, fish, mammals, insects. And of course, the classic example is magnetotactic bacteria.
Right, they use it to line up perfectly.
They align themselves perfectly along field lines using actual chains of magnetite crystals. That's probably the clearest example of biological magnetite in action. Now, there have been some controversies about specific locations in more complex animals, like some early claims about the pigeon beak.
I remember reading about that.
Yeah, that seems less likely now to be the primary receptor site. But evidence for magnetite elsewhere, maybe in the inner ear, or potentially linked to the trigeminal nerve in birds and fish, seems much stronger.
And the magnetite mechanism seems better suited for sensing field intensity for navigation, like a map.
Yes, precisely. Because it can sense both polarity and intensity, it's considered a strong candidate for animals that seem to build a magnetic map. By sensing variations in field intensity and inclination across the globe, they could potentially estimate their position, not just their heading direction.
So we have the potential for a chemical quantum compass in the eye, and maybe a physical magnet compass map sense located elsewhere. But studying these incredibly weak forces and subtle effects in living animals, that must be really challenging.
Oh, it's immensely challenging. Animals can't just tell us what they're sensing. Scientists have developed some really ingenious methods over the years.
So tell us about a few key experimental approaches they use.
Well, a classic technique is behavioral orientation assays. For birds, the Emlyn funnel is famous.
The funnel, right?
It's basically a funnel-shaped cage where a bird that's ready to migrate hops in its preferred direction. The scratches it leaves on the paper lining show its orientation. By manipulating the magnetic field around the funnel with coils, researchers can test if the bird changes direction accordingly. This was absolutely key for early work showing birds even use a magnetic compass.
And they do change direction, proving they're sensing the field. What about testing this out in the wild, in the animal's natural environment?
That's where field manipulation and displacement experiments come in. A classic example is attaching tiny magnets to homing
Oh,
pigeons.
that messes them up.
It disrupts their navigation, yeah, especially on cloudy days when they can't use the sun as a primary cue, or displacing animals like sea turtles or spiny lobsters to different magnetic locations and observing if they orient as if they know where they are based on the new magnetic coordinates that provides evidence for that magnetic map sense.
Okay, using the field not just for direction, but for location. Back in the lab, those Helmholtz coils seem essential for creating controlled magnetic environments.
Absolutely essential. These allow scientists to cancel the Earth's field entirely, apply specific artificial fields, and perform cue conflict tests, pitting magnetic cues against visual or other cues to see which one wins out. And they're also critical for that diagnostic RF disruption test we mentioned earlier.
The radio frequency one.
Yes,
Yeah.
applying weak oscillating fields to see if it disorients the animal. If it does, it strongly suggests a radical pair mechanism. If it doesn't, but maybe a strong magnetic pulse does disrupt them, that points more towards magnetite. You see the contrast, for instance, between birds, which are often RF sensitive, and mole rats, which seem to be RF insensitive.
Ah, interesting. And using simpler organisms allows for genetic and molecular approaches, right? Like with fruit flies.
Yes, Drosophila was seen as a great model for a while because we can easily manipulate their genes, like the gene for cryptochrome. Early studies suggested flies had a light-dependent magnetic sense linked to cryptochrome, which was seen as a big win for the radical pair theory.
But I understand there's been some controversy or debate more recently about the flies.
There has, yes. A large, multi-lab replication study attempted to reproduce those earlier positive findings in flies using many, many more animals and very rigorous methods. And they essentially didn't find statistically significant magnetic orientation across the board.
Oh. So does that mean they don't have the sense?
Not necessarily. It might mean the effect is much subtler than initially thought, or maybe depends on very specific conditions. But it really highlights how crucial rigorous methods and replication are in this field, especially when you're dealing with potentially weak effects that are hard to measure consistently.
That must be tough for researchers.
Yeah.
What about looking directly into the brain or nervous system? Can they see the signals there?
That's neurobiological recording, and it's key to understanding how the signal is processed. Scientists have found neurons in birds that respond to magnetic fields. They seem to be located in areas potentially linked to the trigeminal nerve.
Which might carry signals from magnetite.
Exactly, thought to carry signals from potential magnetite receptors. And also in a specific forebrain region called cluster N, which gets active during magnetic orientation and seems connected to the visual system, which fits nicely with the cryptochrome in the eye idea.
And isn't this also where some fascinating work on humans comes in? The brain activity.
It is. While we definitely don't consciously sense the magnetic field, a study published back in 2019 used EEG, which measures brainwaves, and found something really intriguing.
What did they find?
When human volunteers were exposed to specific rotations of an Earth-strength magnetic field inside a controlled chamber, they showed a significant drop in alpha wave amplitude. A brainwave pattern usually associated with sort of restful alertness or the brain idling.
So their brains reacted even if they didn't feel anything?
That's the interpretation. It's physiological evidence suggesting our brain detects the changes in the magnetic field, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
That's mind-blowing. So our brains might be reacting without us ever knowing consciously. And finally, the really cutting-edge stuff, biophysical and quantum measurements on the molecules themselves.
Yeah, this is trying to bridge the gap between the whole animal and the molecular level. Researchers are studying candidate molecules like cryptochrome in vitro.
In a test tube, basically.
Right, outside the animal, using techniques like advanced spectroscopy. And a major breakthrough came in 2021 with a study showing that Robin Cry-4 protein itself is magnetically sensitive in a test tube. It reacts to magnetic fields. They even identified the internal chemical pathway involved.
Wow, direct proof.
It provides direct molecular evidence that Cry-4 could function as a magnetic sensor, really bolstering the radical pair hypothesis for birds. And physical chemists are also building synthetic model systems that mimic the cryptochrome reaction to rigorously test if the quantum physics holds up at Earth-strength field levels. And it seems to.
So it really takes every tool in the scientific toolbox, from watching birds in a funnel to zapping them with RF fields to studying molecules with quantum physics to even begin to understand this hidden sense. Let's take a quick tour through the animal kingdom now and highlight some key players and what we think we know about their magnetic sense.
Okay. Birds, especially migratory songbirds like the European robin, are the classic example. Their light-dependent, inclination-only compass is really the poster child for the radical pair mechanism, strongly implicating cryptochrome.
And that recent work points to a specific cryptochrome.
Yes, cryptochrome 4, or Cry4, in the retina is the leading candidate now. It's found in the right cells, photoreceptor cells. It seems to be expressed constantly, even when they aren't migrating, suggesting it's always on. And crucially, its magnetic sensitivity has now been proven in vitro. Plus, those RF disruption experiments in robins further support this quantum mechanism.
But birds might have a second system too, right? You mentioned that earlier.
Yes, there's good evidence for a two-sensor model in birds. Besides the radical pair compass for just getting the direction, they likely use a separate magnetite-based receptor,
Okay.
possibly located near the inner ear or linked to the trigeminal nerve, for a magnetic map sense. The system would be light independent and helps them determine their actual location based on gradients in field intensity and inclination. This seems key for homing pigeons and long-distance migrants figuring out where they are, not just which way to go.
Fascinating that one animal might combine a quantum chemical sensor with a physical magnetic one. What about insects? Is it similar there?
Insects show quite a bit of variety. Monarch butterflies, famous for their long migrations, seem to use a light-dependent magnetic compass as a backup system on cloudy days when they can't see the sun's polarization pattern. And this is linked to their cryptochromes, specifically Cry1 in monarchs, suggesting a radical pair mechanism similar, perhaps, to birds.
And fruit flies.
Fruit flies, as we discussed, were important for early genetic studies linking cryptochrome to magnetic sensing, but the recent replication controversy means we're still trying to clarify the extent and reliability of their magnetic sense. It might be quite subtle.
Okay.
Then you have honeybees. They have magnetic material, likely magnetite, found in their abdomen. They seem to use it for orientation within the dark hive, and maybe even for gauging distance flown during foraging dances. This points more towards a magnetite system.
So insects show evidence for both potential mechanisms, depending on the species. What about mammals? It seems less pronounced in us, maybe, but definitely there in some.
Much less obvious, often subtle or subconscious, but definitely confirmed in several species. African mole rats are a fantastic case.
Yeah, on the ground, right.
Exactly, underground in complete darkness. They align their nests precisely along magnetic north-south. Their compass is polarity-based. They know north from south. It works without light. It is disrupted by magnetic pulses, and it's not disrupted by RF fields. All those signs point strongly to magnetite.
And the surprising part is where they sense it. I remember reading something unexpected.
Yes, this was a big surprise. Despite living in total darkness and having tiny, basically non-functional eyes for vision, experiments showed that removing these eyes actually eliminated their magnetic orientation ability.
Wow. So the receptors are in the eye.
It seems the receptors are likely magnetite-based and located in or somehow associated with the eye, maybe the cornea. It looks like evolution has repurposed a vestigial visual organ for this completely different hidden sense.
That's just wild. Bats also use magnetism. They fly at night.
Yes, nocturnal bats use a magnetic compass, likely magnetite-based, to help maintain consistent flight direction, especially over long distances or unfamiliar terrain. They seem to calibrate it using sunset cues.
Interesting. Another of those more controversial observations, this cow and deer alignment thing.
Right. Some large-scale field observations, often using satellite imagery, suggested that cattle and deer tend to align their bodies north-south when grazing or resting. It hints at a possible subconscious magnetic sense, perhaps using magnetite. It's debated. Definitely other factors like wind or sun could play a role, but it's an intriguing possibility of a subtle, perhaps subconscious effect in large mammals. Other mammals, like mice and dogs, have also shown some tentative magnetic responses in specific lab studies.
And then there's the big question of whether we have it. Humans.
That 2019 human EEG study was really significant because it provided the first clear physiological evidence that change in brain activity, the alpha waves in response to magnetic field changes, even without any conscious perception.
So what could be sensing it in us?
The mechanism in humans is completely unknown. Could it be latent magnetite receptors somewhere? Could our own cryptochromes, which are involved in our circadian rhythms, also have some residual magnetic sensitivity that our brain detects but doesn't use for navigation? It's highly controversial, needs rigorous replication by independent labs, but it's definitely sparked a lot of renewed interest in whether we possess some kind of hidden vestigial magnetic sense.
Moving to the water now, marine animals are renowned navigators, and magnetism seems absolutely key for them.
Absolutely critical. Loggerhead sea turtles are probably the champions of magnetic navigation.
Incredible journeys they make.
Incredible. Both the tiny hatchlings heading out to sea and the adults migrating thousands of miles use the subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field's inclination angle and intensity like a map. They can figure out their latitude and longitude effectively just from the magnetic field, allowing them to navigate across vast oceans and find their way back to their specific natal beaches decades later.
Man, that sounds like.
That's a clear example of a magnetite-based magnetic map sense. It has to work in deep water where light is scarce or non-existent, so the light-dependent radical pair mechanism isn't really feasible for that kind of navigation.
In salmon finding their way home to spawn.
Salmon also use magnetic cues. They likely sense them via magnetite crystals found in their nasal tissue near the olfactory system. This probably helps them with the ocean phase of their migration and maybe recognizing the unique magnetic signature of their home river system alongside their amazing sense of smell. Again, another strong candidate for a magnetite compass and map system.
Makes sense.
Spiny lobsters also use a magnetic map sense for homing after being displaced, navigating over reefs at night, again, probably magnetite-based.
And newts are a weird exception in aquatic environments. Or maybe not exception, but interesting case.
Yes, amphibians like newts are interesting because some studies suggest they show both light-dependent and light-independent magnetic orientation. And even stranger, their preferred direction can sometimes shift depending on the color of the light they're under. It is weird. It suggests they might potentially utilize both radical pair and magnetite systems, maybe for different tasks or under different conditions, which would be quite unique. But generally speaking, magnetite mechanisms seem to be more dominant in aquatic and marine settings, likely because light is often limited for the cryptochrome system to work reliably.
Okay, so looking back over roughly the last decade, say 2015 to 2025, what have been the biggest breakthroughs or confirmed steps forward in understanding all this?
It's really been a period of significant progress, I'd say. Pinpointing Cry4 as the most likely radical pair candidate protein in birds was huge. That built on years of work.
Right.
Then following that up with the direct in vitro proof of robin Cry4's magnetic sensitivity in 2021 was a landmark moment. It showed the protein itself can actually do the job.
Confirmation at the molecular level.
Exactly. And from the physics side, validating that radical pair reactions can respond meaningfully to Earth strength fields and realistic chemical model systems gave crucial confidence to the underlying quantum theory. It wasn't just theoretical anymore.
Proving the physics isn't just abstract, it's possible in these biological conditions.
Precisely. There's also been significant progress in live animal studies. Things like tracking where magnetic signals are processed in the bird brain, like identifying cluster N activity, refining our understanding of the pigeon's likely magnetite system moving away from the beak hypothesis, and showing that human-made RF noise can potentially disrupt bird orientation in urban environments.
And the mammal research has really advanced too, it sounds like.
Definitely. The mole rat eye study was a major finding, completely overturning previous assumptions about where their sense was located. And of course, the human EEG study in 2019, despite the caveats about needing replication, really put human magnetoreception back on the map as a serious, testable scientific question.
It sounds like a lot of previous uncertainty, maybe some confusion, is starting to clear up or at least get focused.
Yes, I think so. Addressing some of the earlier controversies, like the ambiguity around the fruit fly results with that large replication study, and clarifying the likely role and location of magnetite in pigeons, has helped refine the field's understanding. There's also much stronger interdisciplinary collaboration now, quantum physicists talking to chemists, talking to biologists. That's crucial.
Yeah.
And importantly, scientists are beginning to seriously think about biomimetic technology. How can we learn from these amazing biological systems to perhaps create new kinds of sensors or navigation tools?
So much has been learned, but I'm sure there are still plenty of open questions and debates buzzing around.
Oh, absolutely. This is still a very young and incredibly complex field. One key ongoing debate is simply understanding which mechanism is used by which animal, and whether some truly use both simultaneously or maybe switch between them in different contexts. There can sometimes be a tendency to favor one hypothesis,
Like the radical pair because it's so novel.
Perhaps. So scientists need to be careful to design experiments that can really distinguish between them or detect both if they're present.
Right, avoiding that hypothesis biases. And the core signal amplification. How does such a weak signal get noticed?
That's a major puzzle. Earth's magnetic field is so incredibly weak. How does a tiny change in a molecular reaction rate or a minute physical movement of a tiny crystal get amplified into a strong enough neural signal for the animal's brain to actually use reliably? What are the downstream cellular signaling pathways? We're still mapping all that out.
And mapping how that information flows through the brain must be incredibly complex too.
It is. Understanding the neural pathways and how magnetic information is processed is a huge frontier. Does a bird literally see the magnetic field as some kind of visual pattern overlay? How is magnetic information integrated with input from other senses like vision or olfaction in the brain's navigation centers? And for that human response, where in the brain is that detection actually happening? We don't know.
What about the deep history of this sense? Where did it come from?
The evolutionary origins are really debated. Did this sense evolve just once, very early on, or has it evolved multiple times independently in different lineages? We see it in bacteria, which shows it's ancient.
Very ancient.
But tracing its path through complex animals is tricky. It might be a great example of convergent evolution, where different groups arrived at similar solutions independently.
And given how subtle the effects are, I imagine reproducibility of experiments remains a significant challenge.
Yes, it absolutely does. Studies with small effect sizes, especially behavioral ones that rely on animal choices, can be notoriously difficult to replicate consistently. Some of the controversial results we've mentioned, the cow alignment studies, the fly studies, even the human EEG finding, highlight the critical need for really robust experimental designs, large sample sizes, and independent verification by multiple labs to build solid confidence in the findings.
The human magnetoreception possibility is just so fascinating.
Yeah.
If it turns out to be real and replicable, why do we even have it? What's it for?
That's a huge unknown. Is it just a non-functional evolutionary remnant from distant ancestors who perhaps used it more actively? Does it serve some subtle subconscious purpose we haven't even thought to look for yet? Or is it simply a passive side effect? Maybe molecules like cryptochrome that are involved in other essential processes like circadian rhythms just happen to have an inherent magnetic sensitivity, even if our brains don't actively use that information for navigation anymore. We just don't know.
And getting down to the absolute nitty-gritty molecular level, still work to do there.
Oh, definitely. Still many fine details to uncover. For the radical pair mechanism, precisely what are the partner molecules involved with cryptochrome in different species? How exactly does the change in spin state trigger the downstream cellular signal? For the magnetite mechanism, how is a tiny magnetite crystal mechanically coupled to open a specific type of ion channel? Identifying these specific protein interactions and the exact molecular steps is really ongoing work.
And connecting it back to the environment, what about the impact of all the electromagnetic noise we create?
Yeah, that's a growing area of concern in research. Could artificial electromagnetic noise from power lines, all our electronics, communication systems like 5G, could that interfere with animal navigation systems that rely on subtle magnetic cues? Some studies suggest that urban EM noise might affect bird orientation, for instance, which raises potential conservation implications. But proving this definitively is very difficult, teasing apart magnetic effects from all the other disturbances in urban environments, so it's still actively debated and needs more research.
So, plenty of pieces still missing from the puzzle, but the research is clearly moving forward quickly. What's next on the horizon? Where do scientists hope to make the biggest strides in the coming years?
Well, I think the ultimate goal is more definitive answers, conclusive identification of the specific receptor cells and organs, actually being able to point to and characterize the exact cells that hold the magnetic material or house the cryptochrome arrays, using advanced microscopy and maybe even new quantum sensing techniques to visualize these structures.
And using modern genetic tools to prove function.
Yes, absolutely. Genetic engineering and functional tests. Techniques like CRISPR could potentially allow scientists to knock out candidate genes like Cry4 in birds or other key model animals, and then directly test if their magnetic sense is lost or impaired. That would provide powerful causal evidence linking gene to function.
Or even watching the process happen in real time inside the animal.
In vivo monitoring is kind of the holy grail. Using advanced optical methods or other techniques to potentially visualize the magnetic field influencing radical pair states or magnetite dynamics inside a living animal as it's actually navigating. That would be incredibly challenging technically, but absolutely groundbreaking if achieved.
And mapping the brain's processing in more detail.
Definitely. More detailed mapping of the neural circuits that receive and process magnetic information. Understanding how these pathways integrate with other sensory inputs in brain regions responsible for navigation and spatial awareness. And of course, following up robustly on that human EEG study to pinpoint where in our brain that magnetic response originates, if it holds up.
Expanding the search to more species seems logical too.
Absolutely. There are countless animal species out there where magnetoreception hasn't been systematically studied or studied at all. Applying these newer, more rigorous techniques across a wider phylogenetic range could reveal completely new mechanisms or interesting variations on the known themes.
And digging deeper into the real-world environmental impacts.
Yes, environmental impact studies need more rigorous investigation. We need to understand better if anthropogenic EM fields or natural events like solar storms significantly disrupt animal navigation on a large scale, and what the consequences might be for populations and ecosystems.
And the technology aspect you mentioned. Building things based on this.
Developing biomimetic technology inspired by these biological sensors remains an exciting future direction. Could we build artificial compasses based on radical pair chemistry or novel magnetite structures that are perhaps more energy efficient or operate differently than current technology? Maybe don't rely on GPS. Also, exploring the potential of magnetogenetics using magnetic fields to remotely control genetically engineered cells for research or therapeutic purposes.
And finally, putting all the different pieces together for the bigger picture.
Exactly. Integrative navigation ecology. Understanding how magnetoreception fits into the animal's full suite of navigation tools, how it interacts synergistically with vision, smell, hearing, maybe internal cognitive maps, celestial cues like the sun and stars, tracking animals in their natural environments with sophisticated tags to see exactly how and when they deploy their magnetic sense in the real world.
It's just astonishing to think about, really. Life tapping into Earth's invisible magnetic field using principles that might involve quantum physics, or tiny physical magnets derived from minerals. It's a field that sits right at this amazing crossroads of biology, chemistry, and physics.
It truly is. And it reminds us constantly that the world is full of senses and perceptions that are completely outside our own experience, things we can't even easily imagine. The fact that something as fundamental and, frankly, abstract as quantum mechanics might be happening inside a bird's eye or a butterfly's antenna to help guide its incredible migration is just, well, it's breathtaking.
So maybe the next time you see a flock of birds flying overhead in perfect formation, or watch a monarch butterfly drift by on its long journey, or maybe even just look at your own hand, consider this. These creatures, and perhaps even you, might be subtly connected to the Earth's magnetic field in ways we're only just beginning to understand. Navigating not just by what they see or hear, but by feeling the fundamental, invisible pulse of the planet itself.